Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel called Identity Breach Response. And you joined the whole day summit for this Identity Security Summit. So we have heard a lot of topics about the protection side, the framework side, the technology side. I also want to remind you, there's one major area you have to take care of and look into that. That's really the incident response. What happened after the identity breach? So that's a reason we bring this a very unique and high value panel here. As a quick introduction, my name is Bryan Lee. I'm the founder of Cyber Tech and Risk and also serve as this panel moderator. As you can see, we have our four amazing panels members here. So we have Dom from Equifax, Global Director from Global Breach Regulatory Services from Equifax. We have Cameron from BMO. So Cameron is the Senior Manager, AML Financial Intelligence Unit. And we have Dan from BLG. So Dan is a partner at BLG. And we have Frank from Lodestone, and Frank is the CEO at Lodestone. All right, so I will ask our panel members to also do a quick self-introduction about what you do and give an idea about your practice. Maybe we start with Dom first.
Sure, thanks, Brian. Yep, my name's Domenic Paci. I'm with Equifax. I have been working in the breach response space for going on about 8 years now. I am, along with the gentleman here, I'm actually more towards the end of an incident sometimes, where I work with companies that have had a breach where they're looking to offer protection to the breached individuals, so employees or customer base. With that, turn it over to Dan. Dan?
Thanks, Dom. Dan Michaluk here. I'm a partner at BLG, a law firm that has offices across Canada, and I'm a data security and privacy lawyer who does a lot of incident response. I think I did my first major incident in 2006, and it wasn't straight line to now, but it's quite busy now, as you might expect. So I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Brian, and everybody.
All right. Whoever next, Frank, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Brian, and also pleasure to be here. Frank Luzsicza, I'm the CEO at Lodestone. Lodestone is a cybersecurity firm specializing in breach investigations, and it's a managing high-risk environments for our clients. Prior to Lodestone, I'd spent about 20 years in the industry, 17 of that with IBM, leading different parts of IBM's global security unit, and most recent 3 years with sort of pseudo private equity firm acquiring, integrating, and growing cybersecurity businesses around the world. So again, thanks for the invitation, Brian. Glad to be here.
Excellent, thank you. Last but not least, Cameron.
Thanks, Brian, and thrilled to be here and on this panel with some great minds. I'm presently with the Bank of Montreal's anti-money laundering team, specifically in the Financial Intelligence Unit. I'm the Senior Manager of AML Intelligence Liaison, and work quite extensively with law enforcement, intelligence, and other government agencies. Prior to that, I served for just over 32 years with the Toronto Police Service. One of my finer periods of time was the commander of the corporate crimes team in the Organized Crime Enforcement Service. And for this particular panel, I hope to be talking about middle to endpoint results of identity breaches and how it affects the ecosystem between financial institutions and law enforcement. And thrilled to be here.
All right. Okay, so that's four of our panel members. As you can see, they have their very unique background, but also deeply involved with law enforcement, regulatory, and also incident response. So glad to have them to come to share with their insights. All right, so as a panel moderator, I'd like to ask my first questions. So about the identity breach, what can really happen? Because most of us probably heard or saw something on the TV or hear something from the news, but what can really happen? How big it is? Can you guys share some insights from your end? I don't know who want to go first. Maybe Dan, you want to go first?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, Brian. I guess from my perspective, what can happen with an identity breach is it can turn into a lawsuit. Really, I mean, class action claims often follow security incidents now, and corporations are made liable for damages that are based primarily on a theory that relates to identity theft and identity fraud. So it's very hard for individuals to prove that their fraud is linked to the loss of any particular information, but they will nonetheless claim for the costs of protection itself. So the costs of signing up for credit monitoring with Dom and others, the costs of checking credit reports and running, and they'll get you that way. So that's one thing that can happen.
Okay, great. Since you mentioned Dom's name, I guess Dom will be the next one.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I think really there's a lot of things that can happen. You can really end up with a kind of a snowball event where if the right moves aren't made, meaning the right legal counsel might not be brought in, the right forensics company might not be brought in. If you're making moves and you've never gone through something like a breach before, definitely don't be afraid to raise your hand for help. And there are plenty of us in the industry who've been doing this for a while that can definitely help out. You want to make sure, there are mistakes that can be made. One mistake I've seen made is just because a company has general counsel doesn't mean their general counsel has ever handled a breach. So their general counsel might have to, as my gym instructor says, check your ego at the door so you don't hurt yourself. You might need to have your general counsel raise their hand and go out to hire a privacy law firm that is an expert to be able to help them out with that incident. And the same thing goes if you have, I've heard a lot of people say, well, we spend all this money on endpoint protection. Well, nothing's foolproof. So always look for always look for help in a case like this, especially if it's something you've never gone through before.
All right, so that's a valuable insight. And Frank, I know you're on the forensic side. So what do you see from that angle?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, fundamentally identity theft is a source of financial gain at a loss of the victim, right? It is, very expensive at worst and very inconvenient at best to that particular individual that's targeted. It also has some very ugly downstream implications, right? Usually a breached identity is available for sale on the dark web for a long period of time after the breach. Things like social security numbers, addresses, driver's license numbers, credit card numbers, only some of which can be changed, right? Some of this is very static and very sort of fixed information. And it is easily available for other threat actors, bad actors to then exploit anytime in the future. So that immediate loss of personal information, and of course the downstream effects of that. So losing personal information, I think from an employer or from an organization standpoint, so for employees or customers, as Dom had pointed out, is just a big liability for companies and other and other entities, and often a recipe for as Dan also said, just a class action or regulatory fines in addition to that personal impact of the individual being breached. Great
point. So as you mentioned, so the loss is not just limited by that person, right? So it's like you have a ripple effect for the downstream. So even for another corporation, right? So across all the industry as well. All right. So Camara, what's your view on that? Camara you have a unique background. One part is law enforcement, another is at the corporate. So what do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some phenomenal points here, and really the downstream is I think where the nightmare is, and I would say from the outset when these breaches do occur, I think companies have to be quite open with the extent of the breach and really mitigating the risk, downstream risk, and getting a great sense of what happened if law enforcement comes in, potentially if you're in the United States or in Canada, you might get FBI cyber breach teams or RCMP or what have you. That happens in certain cases. But really, there's a few questions I think these affected companies need to answer, and that is, what did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? And I think that's, if all three are covered, there's a lot of downstream impact. I work for a financial institution. These data breaches, as has been demonstrated, they go on the dark web for sale, and they can be sold and resold and resold. They result in such things as account takeovers and other types of fraudulent activity, which does wreak havoc with banks and with our existing customers, and downstream into the money laundering regime. So yeah, it's really good to get it right first, and to really ask those three questions and make sure that there's some really good answers, and that will help mitigate some of the problems and risk.
Mm-hmm. All right, so thanks for sharing your insight. Obviously, there's a very serious consequence after the identity theft. So back to the question, how can we, so on one side, we need to focus on protection, right? So really to avoid those things happen. But what if it really happened? So in the term, really, it's called incidental response. So and specifically for identity theft. So how can we build a proper identity theft response process? There may be many questions related to that. Things like who need to be involved? What should we do? Do we need a checklist, or who need to talk to? Do we need a breach coach, something like that? Right. So I'd like to hear your opinion on that. And Dom, you want to start?
Yeah, sure, Brian. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit on a lot of points there. I'll just focus on a couple of those. I think the who, the who, what, and whens are really what you need to start answering really early on. Meaning, who at your company needs to be made aware of this? Who do you need to bring in? Who is the potentially impacted population? Was there a population that was impacted? And as you work with your internal IT security, your external forensics companies to identify what actually happened, you're dealing with this kind of hair on fire situation where you might feel like the world's coming to an end, but you still need to make sure that you have a key group of people that are keeping cooler heads during the situation to really think through what the next steps are. What do we need to do? What do we need to avoid? Who needs to know? From your previous question about what to do, or what to do, one thing that I've seen happen is sometimes companies think they're doing the right thing by informing everybody of, hey, we had this breach. We don't know much, but we had this breach. That's not always the best thing. You want to make sure that you start to gain an understanding, and you also want to make sure you have a key identified group of who needs to know. And part of the reason why you do that is so you can kind of control what's going on in your environment and control what's going on in your world. It's like I said, it's a hair on fire situation. You might feel like it's the end of the world, and you might feel like you're panicking. But you gotta take a deep breath. You need to focus on it, and you need to get control of the situation so you can address it. You're going to be dealing with internal people, external people, and you want to make sure that you're giving a crisp message around that, showing that you are in control of the situation. So, okay,
I think one of the key message I get there is also need to be calm, right? So you need to get prepared there. Because it's like on fire, right? So at that moment, so many calls, so many people want to get your attention, and you have a very almost no time to respond to everything. So from that angle, maybe Dan, can you share some insights from what you see? How do we build a proper incident response process?
Yeah, I'm going to build on Dom's first answer, which gave me warm and fuzzies, Dom. Thank you. Yeah, you have to get the right talent at the table, and unless you're really huge and experiencing incidents over and over again, it usually involves external talent, like a lawyer who acts as a quote unquote breach coach or incident response counsel, and a technical incident response provider like Frank's firm. And ideally, the coach and the technical provider have worked together before and have a relationship and kind of know the rhythm and together. I'll give you a brief idea of what the lawyer typically does as coach. I think the fundamental role is to advise on the response so it's optimized for judgment, right? Like I think as lawyers, we understand that all of the communications and all of the actions will be potentially evidence, and we want to kind of make the evidence look good. So things are well timed. Like Dom said, you're not rushing out with things that are loud and unclear too early. That you're making a proper judgment about the scope of the forensic analysis. You're not going too narrow and missing things. You're not going too broad and wasting money. You're making proper judgments about the scope of notification. When you're communicating, you're being contrite but not defensive. You're being clear and accurate, and you're doing all those things. And if you get it right, and rely on good help who's been through it over and over again, you'll kind of almost hide in the noise, you know, like so many organizations have incidents and so few become incidents that stand out. And you want to just do everything smoothly and normally, very calmly, get it all out, and you'll get to the end of it. And if you do it really well, unless you're a target for some special reason, it'll end. You'll be better for it, and your security program will go back to situation normal. I think that's the role of the coach.
Okay, great. Great to hear your insights. To our other panel members, what do you see there?
Maybe I can piggyback on Dan's response because I think it was really well structured. Just asking the question that you're asking, Bryan, here, I think is such an important step in proper planning and preparation, right? How do you build a proper identity threat response process? So if you take the time to really develop and build your response, I think you will be in a position, as Dan described, sort of calm and collected, able to execute some of those critical steps. And I think it is also important to point out that the previous sessions, the prior sessions of the summit, already touched upon the prevention, right? What does it mean to prevent some of the breaches of personal information, the PII, PHI, and knowing where it sits, knowing where the controls are, what those controls are. Some of your other session touched upon the visibility. So all these steps that lead up to being effective in that breach response. And to add a couple points from a technical incident response perspective, you know, our role is typically to assemble the facts that clearly communicate what had happened, right? When did it happen? What tools, what techniques, what procedures the bad actors used, and then ultimately what was the impact of the breach, if there even was a breach. And then of course work with legal counsel to assemble a very, very cohesive and direct, clear message on that impact statement. And again, I think it can be executed with a proper planning, with a proper thought process, and of course, pulling the right team together, as you had pointed out, Bryan, in your second question, is who really needs to be involved. And that's very, very key and critical.
Excellent. Wonderful. And Ken, can you add a bit more on that one?
Yeah, just really briefly, and I hope this dovetails into all the comments here, and specifically what Dom said in the beginning. And that really is, you know, work that was done prior to the breach. I think every company on the planet that is connected to the internet, there's an eventuality that there could be a breach. If for those of us of a certain age, if you remember 15 years ago, a breach wasn't so common. Now it's just, oh, you haven't been breached, or depending on what area. And so there's this really good chance that a breach will happen. And from a legal standpoint, in terms of due diligence and prior to the breach actually happening, which, you know, is dour thinking, but, you know, what has your company done to prepare for a breach? So if the breach actually happens, and I know we're going to talk about playbooks at some point in the next few minutes, but really just doing something above like a blue team, red team kind of exercise, but really just have your people all connected and agile, gettable by phone, and simply saying, doing a code word for we've had a breach, and then you just start convening your playbook and going through repetitive exercises where you'll know exactly what to do. You'll have your breach coach lined up, but we always kind of revert to our training when these things happen, and it's just something to keep in mind. In addition to all these great points here, that a company is truly prepared for that breach. And to Dom's point, there's no panic. Well, we know what to do. We've done this before. We've done the exercises, and let's just get to it.
All right, cool. So we touch on the playbook, which kind of like our Bible or checklist for how do you respond. You kind of get prepared beforehand rather than in the last minute you write your playbook on the spot. All right, so I do see a couple of people on our chat to ask questions. So there are questions really regarding the message. One, I guess, also related to kind of a PR for your incident, right? So I think Mark mentioned that. So what if all your systems are down right now? So how do you manage and impact all the employees? So that could be identity things. So how do you manage that message? How do you kind of report to the public there's a breach? So any thoughts on that one?
Well, I think since we touched on the playbook, one basic step of every company's playbook should be gathering all employees' personal email, like a way to communicate with employees, because I'm thinking about probably a handful of incidences I've worked on this past year where I received a phone call from a breached entity, and they're saying to me, "Oh, well, we can't get any email because our company email's down." And they'll ask us, "We don't know how to do this." It's like, okay, well, if moving forward as part of your playbook, collect other forms of email, other emails, so you can reach out to your staff, and we can communicate with you with other emails. So I mean, that's a very basic thing. But Brian, I heard you mention PR. Definitely, depending on the scale of your incident, just like you engage in outside counsel, I would recommend speaking with your breach coach or your outside counsel about who they would recommend for PR. And just like law firms, and this is just from my experience, just like law firms, not all PR firms are created equally. There are PR firms that do crisis management. But again, I definitely recommend speaking to your breach coach or your legal counsel about who might be somebody you could speak with about a PR response. Because again, it is important to get that message out there right the first time. So.
All right. So Dan, any comment on that?
Yeah, no, I like that answer, Dom. But the playbook can get quite practical, and if you run scenarios to practice various, and you don't have to practice the whole thing. You can practice various components of the scenario as well to identify issues and deal with the very practical things in your playbook. The one that I dealt with the other day was immediate containment steps. So from the time someone realizes that there's a problem to the time the network cable comes out of the machine or the wall, it actually can be quite important. And it's a very practical exercise of figuring out how you do that and how quickly. Like, who's going to go to the office? How are we going to contact them in the middle of the night when these things happen? And minutes count. So let's just talk that through. And it can be a simple discussion at around a boardroom table, and it'll do the job.
Anyone want to add more? Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So we have a playbook, we respond that one, but for all those data like compromised, it's already out, right? So it's already at the bad guy's hand, or they may use that for the future attack or whatever way they want. So how do we do that? How can we learn from those like a past breach, the incidents, or some intelligence we can leverage from that angle? So with that question, actually, I want to start with Cam first.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I think it's probably one of the most important steps, because breaches are inevitable in a lot of cases, and having that ability to truly assess what happened, doing some kind of like a cyber autopsy on how did this happen from end to end, and that company or entity must ask some really tough questions, like where did we fall short? How did the breach occur? Like get that expert analysis, get phenomenal legal support, PR support, but really have that meaningful, very open and honest kind of cyber autopsy. I know that's not the right word, but to truly get a sense of what happened, so that moving forward, maybe the playbook needs to be adjusted, maybe technology needs deeper investments, maybe responses need to be altered, or it could be a variety or a combination of all those things, but really have that honest, really difficult conversation internally within the company, and then move forward and truly make it truly pivot and make it an opportunity to really target hardened entity and move forward.
All right. Okay, good. Very good insight. Frank, what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, because it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to learn from and improve your security controls based on past incidents. And first and foremost, I would say developing an ability to learn from others' mistakes and misfortunes is perhaps the first prerequisite, and that means being able to ingest and make cybersecurity intelligence actionable, right? Being able to ingest others' incidents and events, and as a result, be able to do something actionable. I think that's one of the most difficult, perhaps one of the biggest challenges that our industry faces right now, is to be able to methodically be able to execute on that. But assuming that you do, assuming that you prepare for what others are facing, then it's your ability to recognize the patterns, right? And ability to recognize that the TTPs, the tools, the techniques, the procedures that the threat actors are using, and be able to map them back to some of that threat intelligence to say, yes, something very malicious or something at least anomalous is happening, and I need to be able to respond to that. So that's sort of the learning process that we try to instill and help our clients develop. But just being open and candid, it's very difficult, and it's a challenging problem to undertake.
All right, cool. We have a couple of minutes left. So Dan and Dom, what's your opinion on the last question? So how can we learn from past incidents?
I can go quickly.
Yeah.
There's two levels. One is the kind of the organizational level, and you really ought to have a debrief baked into your incident response plan. Most people would, I think. And then there's the personal, and I make a rule to myself during an incident that I never second guess myself openly. But I could tell you, there's so many judgment calls through these things, right? Like, you're running other scenarios in your head all the time. And if you're an incident responder who's listening, journal those, right? Don't bring them to the team, because it's just going to get everybody confused and knock everybody off rails. Again, you set a path and you go, but record those decision-making trees in a little journal and take them with you and bring those to the formal debrief, because I think you'll learn a lot. That's becoming my process. I have to force myself to after long days, but it's been really helpful, really helpful.
Reflect on okay,
Yeah.
That's actually a personal learning as well.
Yeah.
All right, Dom, what's your opinion on that one?
Yeah, I think real quick, I like Frank's answer about looking at what other companies have gone through, because until you have a breach, every incident's going to be a little bit different. So until you have a breach, you might not really gain the kind of the understanding of all the different boxes you need to check and all the different things you need to look at while you're going through the breach. And then like Dan said, you always need to do a debrief for sure, probably multiple debriefs depending on how large your organization is. But I think if you're taking the time to participate in this webinar, you're definitely thinking about this as a concern for your company. So I would strongly recommend looking at what other companies have gone through, looking at what other companies have done right. Maybe you've been a part of an incident yourself as a customer. Think about what you felt when you got that letter in the mail. Do you feel it was handled correctly? Do you feel it was handled, you could have done something different, or you would have suggested something different? So there's a lot you can learn from what others have gone through, and I definitely recommend that as well.
All right, thanks. All right, cool. It's coming to the end of our panel discussion. Really appreciate your input. Before we leave, are there any like a last minute recommendation? I just like to say, considering time, probably just one tip each of you. So I will start with Cam first.
Yeah, wonderful feedback here from my great panelists. As a former law enforcement officer and commander, now into the AML space, these breaches go a long way downstream and they can wreak havoc. All I can say is when it happens, be prepared and be able to demonstrate that preparation.
All right, cool. That's a very valuable tip. Frank, what do you suggest?
Sure. So I'll give you the typical consulting answer. My top recommendation is perhaps to understand the magnitude of the risk first and foremost, right? Work backwards. Any one of us on a panel can probably assist with this if you reach out to us, but try to understand the real dollar impact of losing the PI/PHI data. Start with discovering where it is, then figure out what it would cost if it was breached. And it's really becomes eye-opening exercise that helps us to define the impact statement. And then you can work on the various controls to decide what to implement to lower the likelihood of that bad event. Perfect.
Okay, and Ben?
I'm sure I'll just build on a theme I think that I've heard from the others is that we should share threat information. And I want to say that as being a lawyer on the panel, because we often get told that we tell people to shut up too much, but share it. Share the easy stuff like indicators of compromise and TTPs. And what I'm hearing is a need for even the deeper stuff, the stuff about the learnings and the tougher stuff. I think you've got to be careful in sharing that information. It's more sensitive, but do it because we all have to get better together.
Right. So, because especially for identity, right? So it's not just for one company's issue, right? So the same identity could be used against another company, another organization. So the shared learning, that's actually very important. And Dom, what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think really kind of the last thing I would say is around the playbook concept. Don't be afraid to sit down and put together maybe a low-tech playbook. Just because we're calling it a playbook, it doesn't need to be anything crazy. It doesn't need to be special. I'd say, you could, I think we were talking, Cameron mentioned about how nobody really had dealt with breaches 15 years ago. 30 years ago, nobody knew what a business continuity plan was. Now, a lot of companies have them, and they're pretty easy to put together. And same thing with playbook. You can really put together a very basic playbook, get a handful of your best trusted employees and say, we need to put this together in case of emergency break glass scenario. And it can be very low tech. It's just so you have a checklist basically of what to do if something was to happen.
Perfect. All right, that's all the time we have for this panel. Again, thank you very much for our elite panel members. Cam from BMO, Dan from BLG, Dom from Equifax, and Frank from Lodestone. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, cool.
Brian.